Well, for those who are catching us live, good morning. It's 9:30 here in Wisconsin. Not sure how early it is everywhere else, but I am here this morning with Lynda Findlay, and I'm very excited about this. Lynda and I have just our paths have crossed here and there. We've chatted here and there about a couple of things, but we haven't really been able to spend time together and especially do something like this together. So I'm pretty excited about it. Welcome, Lynda. Thanks for joining me this morning.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and I want to just tell people a little bit about you. Lynda has worked with grieving families for over 30 years. That's a long time after losing her daughter in 1989. And Lynda started a resource and referral service for grieving families. And then she began providing personalized aftercare solutions for hundreds of funeral homes across the nation, which I know is so, so desperately needed, which is why you're doing that. I know when we've talked to some funeral homes, they have said, yeah, we really don't have anything for grieving parents. We have things for all the other stuff, but not for grieving parents. So I know they really appreciate that. And Lynda is now an aftercare specialist who has created and facilitated and coordinated hundreds of workshops, services, and support groups. I know that Lynda also has been putting together grief cruises. You may have heard of some of those. And Dave and I were going to go on one till everything kind of came crashing down for all of us. And Lynda is a Christian lay counselor. And one of the things that she says is that it's her highest honor to enter people's lives and make a difference. I love that. I love that.
Yeah.
So, Lynda, would you start out just by sharing your story with us and what was it that happened that threw you into this world that none of us want to be in?
Yeah. Well, that's a good place to start. I lost my mom in 1988. She had a heart attack and died suddenly 3 weeks later, and we buried her on Christmas Eve day that year.
Wow.
Just after that, I found out I was expecting my first child. And so I went through that pregnancy and ended up having some problems towards the end. And then ended up having my first daughter, Aubrey, and she was born with a lot of different problems that she couldn't live with. And so I had experienced the loss of my mother, went right into this loss of my daughter. And I just, again, was thrown into this world of what has happened here. She was my first child. I didn't have any other children at home. And it was very difficult for me dealing with that. First off, I think for me, it was a, infant loss. So people didn't understand that I lost a child. They thought I lost a pregnancy. And we do lose pregnancies and we grieve those losses and they're just as painful. But how people saw me is that wasn't valid. And so I didn't get the support that I needed. And it was very difficult. So I went several months, struggling through, ended up going to a support group, which I found to be a little bit helpful in the beginning. But by January, Aubrey was born and died in September. By January, I found myself in my basement looking at my washer and dryer and thinking to myself, I don't even remember being down here washing clothes for 4 months. And that hit me. I mean, that really hit me. I was like, oh my gosh, it's like, how is that even possible that I don't remember washing clothes? And that's when I think I recognized that there was something more that I needed as far as support. And so I started, different things like counseling. I did some other support groups. I started reading about anything that I can get my hands on. And little by little, as you know, you go through that journey and you learn, but you're still grieving through the whole thing. And in the support group that I had gotten involved with, because I was collecting so much material, I was sharing it with the group. The group leader at the time asked me if I would be interested in co-facilitating the support group. Now, looking back, it was probably too soon for me to do that, but I did. And then I ended up pregnant with my second daughter. And by the time I was visibly pregnant, I stopped, running that group because I felt people were going to walk in and see a pregnant person and they just lost their child, And so I went back to it after I had Julia. And from there, it was a lot of work. I was working with hospitals. I was in and out, sharing protocol, how to deal with parents that lost a child, an infant, or miscarriage or stillbirth or SIDS child, and just was going in and out meeting people. And it just became more like a full-time job that I was actually, just volunteering my time for. So I went to my local hospice and I knew that they were running support groups, different types of support groups. And I asked them if they would sponsor our group. And so they did. And I had to go through the training in order to facilitate the same group I'd already been facilitating. And from there, I met a lot of funeral directors. As you know, through hospice, you're coming and going, you're meeting funeral directors. And
Mm-hmm.
I just started asking them, what do you do for families after the loss? And 100% of the time they said to me, nothing but we should. And so that
Yeah.
kind of rang a bell for me. I was like, nothing but you should. And I knew
Mm-hmm.
what we were doing for our hospice families. We were following up with them throughout the year. We were mailing them information. We were calling them on the phone. We were providing different, events that they can join us with to, celebrate the lives of their loved ones. And so I kind of put all my things together that I've been collecting and started going to funeral directors and saying to them, here's what I have. And how can we put this together so we can provide it to your families? And that's where I learned about aftercare, that there really was a formal aftercare program that funeral homes would look at and be able to provide to families if they chose to. So that put me on the road to working for all the funeral homes that I have. And so that's basically what's brought me here. Still doing it 30 years later. I have the same funeral homes that I worked for 30 years ago. I still work for them. Yeah.
Wow. Wow, that's quite the story. That's amazing. Um, when you said you joined that first support group and it really wasn't helpful for you at the beginning there, I'm just curious, was it a generic support group or was it a support group for parental loss?
It was a support group for parents that lost a child to miscarriage, stillbirth, newborn death, and SIDS. So it
Hmm.
was specific to that. And it fell under the National Share Office, which is a national organization who works with families who experience those types of losses. And it's important to say, I at first didn't find it helpful because I was probably like the typical person is. You look at that, like, I'm not going to that group and talking to people about what's going on. And
Hmm.
actually, my husband's the one that literally dragged me to that. I mean, literally physically put me in the car and took me to the first meeting, and ended up the first meeting we showed up, it was the wrong night. So I was like, we're not meant to be
Must
in
be a sign, not supposed to go.
that's like I said, it must be a sign. So I don't know, he got that wrong. But anyhow, we ended up going to the, first few meetings. And again, I was still in that first few months of not really wanting to talk about it. It was painful for me to listen to other stories. And then as I gradually got along and realized, what, the whole scenario at the washer and dryer, I'm thinking, I really need so much more. Maybe this is something I really need to invest my time and my effort into and really absorb the support that was available to me. And so yeah, I think that that's typical though for a lot of people when they think about going to support groups, is that they just don't know what to expect. And so oftentimes they don't. And we did find that through hospice. For the number of obituaries I would see in the newspaper, you'd never see those numbers of people or family members come into those support groups. People just,
Exactly.
unfortunately.
That's so true because I know we have a parental support group in our town. We live in a motorhome, so our town is but happens about 6 months out of the year. But before we bought this and started traveling for grieving parents, it's interesting because even the people in the group are like, "Why won't people come?" I know there's so many people out there who've lost their child. How can we get them to come? And I think some of it is because they're not ready, and some of it is, I know my thought was, now at the time I didn't know anyone who'd lost a child. Becca was 29, so we're kind of on opposite ends of the spectrum. I lost an adult child, and I didn't know anyone who'd lost a child. There were no support groups for grieving parents. I'm sure I could have found something through the hospital, a generic support group. It didn't feel like anything like that would help me, but one of the things that I really fought, even if there had been something, I don't think I would have gone. Well, it took me 3 years to go to a weekend conference for grieving moms because I felt like I didn't want to go somewhere where everybody was just going to be a mess like me and I would leave feeling worse than when I went.
Yeah.
That was what I thought it would be like. And so that weekend, I was so embraced. I mean, like the conference didn't start until Saturday morning, and I had to arrive Friday night. I'm in Wisconsin and it was in Indiana. And so I drove and I got to the motel Friday night and I'm just sitting in my room alone. And all of a sudden my hotel phone rings and it was the host of the conference. And she said, "I hear you're checked in. You want to come have dinner with the rest of the team putting this together?" And so, I mean, she just immediately reached out and embraced me. And so I did go to dinner and immediately was just so welcomed. And just the camaraderie itself of just that instant bonding that you discover you have with someone who's lost a child is just instant. And I left that weekend. What I discovered was that I thought it would be horrible being around a bunch of people who were a mess like me. And what I found out was how wonderful it was to be around a bunch of people who were a mess like me. It turned out to be just the opposite, because you didn't have to wear any masks. You didn't have to pretend. You didn't have to fight the tears. You didn't have to feel guilty about laughing. I mean, you could just be. And everybody around you could just be. And we all understood that it was wonderful. It was wonderful. And that was kind of a, I guess, a turning point or a springboard to what Dave and I do now, because it was like, how can I help other parents experience this, that it's a good thing to connect with other parents who have had the same loss.
Yeah, yeah. And it is, I think, probably one of the most helpful things to do for yourself is to get that support, and no better support than another parent who's lost a child. I mean, there's the rest of the world, like we're in this club, like you said, we're in this club that we never wanted to be a part of. And the rest of the world doesn't understand that. But the person who's lost a child is walking on the same path as you. And those are going to be the people who I call those people, those are our lifeline
Yes.
healing. And so those are the people that we want to put in our circle around us to support us through it. And they can best do that. A family can have so many people around them, a bereaved mother and father can have so many people around them. And if none of them are supportive, then they really don't have any support. As although from the outside, it appears, well, they've got a big family, they got a lot of
Right.
people around them, they must be doing well, they look the same as they did before their loss. So people
They're
kind of,
back at work.
yeah, the world is just going ding, 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 and there you are, standing in the midst of your grief. And so it is the other, bereaved parents that can be most helpful. And you're right. Most people think, well, it's sad and it's too painful. I can't deal with it. It's a bunch of people crying. And I always tell people, and you probably do the same thing when they come to our groups at the first meeting, I tell them, you know what, come back 3 times. If after the
Mhm.
third meeting you feel that this is not something for you, then maybe it isn't, and maybe this isn't the right time, because then you
Mhm.
might feel a little differently 3, 4, 5 months down the road. And so we do make people aware of that sometimes you do come to that first meeting and you leave feeling worse than when you came in, but that's to be expected. And I think in our world when we're grieving, we already have dealt with the unexpected and things that were tragedies and things that we never expected to happen. So at least if we're a little bit prepared for that, we at least have that information to help us maybe go to that second meeting and maybe the third meeting. And usually by
Mhm.
that time, people are realizing they're making those connections and they're feeling more supported. Like you had that experience, so that's what people normally would start experiencing.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's a good thing. And again, it's too bad that not most people don't access the support. I'm hoping that's changing now with this online
Mhm.
platform that people are
Yes.
using. It's a little less threatening, I think, and that's a whole nother conversation. But I think it's going to be a silver lining of what's going on now in the world is that more people are going to be used to this type of interacting,
Mhm.
and that this will really benefit people who are grieving because they can find these types of
Yes.
support and access them from home. And so
Yes.
that's my thought on that.
Yeah, and that's one of the hard things about going to conferences and retreats, because I think as a grieving parent, I can make plans and then that day comes and I just can't do it. I can't follow through. And so it's hard to pay for a conference, and if you have to buy plane tickets, and that fear of, I don't know if I can really go when the time comes. But something like this, it's minimal. I mean, you can wear whatever you want on the bottom half. you don't
Well, we
you
suggest
don't have
you don't Zoom best practices, but anyhow.
yeah,
But anyway,
yeah, and you don't have to worry about getting all me. I mean, you could just show up at your computer
oh,
and just sit and listen if that's where you are.
yeah, you don't even have to turn your camera on. That's what I tell people. If you
Exactly.
want to sit and listen, you don't have to turn your camera on. Or if you're getting overwhelmed, a lot of these little cameras have the little flip thing. You
Yep.
can just turn it
Yep.
off. Yeah, there's a lot of convenient options for people that have limited excuses to not be present.
Mhm.
So
Yeah. And I think one, you were talking about parents that the first time they may go to a support meeting, they leave feeling worse, that can happen. And I think, Linda, you might agree with this, that sometimes the reason that happens isn't because of the meeting itself. It's just another one of those realizations that hits you hard. You feel like, I don't belong here. I shouldn't have to be here. And it's, you leave with another measure of reality that you've been faced with, that my child has died and I don't like it. And being around other people whose child has died is a reminder of that. And so I think sometimes that can be more why they leave feeling worse the first time, which is why they need to come back, because they've hit that resistance, that pain. And so now when they come back, it can ease a little bit every time they come back. And then that resistance isn't there so much, so you can begin to receive. And I forget the term you used, absorb the support, which is what we need to do. I love that wording. I had, it was interesting. I went to a conference, a weekend conference in Texas this past year, past November, and there was a mom there who was just a few weeks, I think it was like 4 weeks into it, which shocked everybody because that's awfully early to be attending something like that. Excuse me. And I talked to her the Sunday morning as everything was ending and just kind of asked her about that. And she said she was so glad she came, and she was so surprised that she would get these comments. Wow, you're here this early, that's great. And she kind of didn't understand that. But she was so thankful she came, because she said she felt like she was getting to that point where that initial, it's, you've got that strength going on because people are around you and they're holding you up, and you're kind of in that fog of it, thinking it was a nightmare. And she could tell that all that was starting to lift, and she could tell that right before she came, she was starting to spiral down into that deep, deep darkness. And she wasn't even going to come. And it was almost like your husband, you are going, you are going. If I have to drive you there myself, you're going. And she was so glad she did, because then being around all of these other moms who are ahead of her on the journey could encourage her that, fight your way through that darkness. This is normal. You're going to be in that suffocating pit of darkness. That's part of this grief. And we're here with you, and you're going to go through this and come out the other side. And she said it was so helpful to know that as she was heading in that direction, that she already knew kind of what to expect. I mean, you really don't know what to expect. I didn't even know that kind of suffocating darkness existed until Becca died. But at least she had something to say. This is probably where you're going to head, and we're going to be with you, and you're going to come out the other side. We don't know how long it'll take. And it was a very good thing for her.
Yeah, you used a good word there. I think the word hope. I often hear people in the beginning of their loss, they feel as though, there's no end in sight. But most times what they'll say is, I just want to feel better. And just by them saying
Hmm.
that tells me that there is hope, even if they don't feel it as hope. But that just in the fact
Hmm.
that somebody wants to feel better, it doesn't like the way they're feeling in the current day and how deep and dark that is. That to me is hope. And that's really important, because I think that's what gets people through, is that hope. And whether they find that, again, within themselves, or they find that within a group, or they find it within other people around them, that hope is just so important, because it isn't hopeless. We know that. You and I know that. We've come this far.
Hmm.
And so people coming to these groups and reaching out for the support, that just tells me that they know that they need something, and that to me looks like hope.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'd never thought about that, but that's very true. Just the fact that, when is this pain gonna, I want to feel better. Because if you want to feel better, you're going to try to start moving what's going to make that happen. What can possibly make that happen? And we may think it can't. I mean, they're conflicting thoughts. It's interesting that in posting this on Facebook, I guess this morning, in just putting that we were going to be talking this morning, does it ever get better? And someone posted under there, no. And
Oh,
I it's like, I don't know how far along she is on this journey, but that is how we feel at the beginning, isn't it? I mean, I talk to parents a lot, who you encourage them and you talk to them, about this journey and where they are in this journey, and where I find myself on this journey now. And or like the holidays, Christmas, I can't put up the tree, I'll never put up a tree again, those kinds of things. And maybe they won't, but chances are pretty good they will. Actually, it may not be the same tree, but they'll end up at some point celebrating the holiday again. And the comment always seems to be, well, that may be true for you, but I don't see it happening for me.
But, just using that, is this ever going to get better? No. The fact is that losing your child, the whole incident of losing your child and the experience of losing your child, that piece is never going to get better. That's always going to affect you in the same way, no matter how many years you're past your loss. You probably can say this yourself. You can bring yourself right back to the second you found out that your child died. I mean,
you can bring all that up. Yep.
That better in that space and time that the person made that comment. It's never going to get better that their child died. But what they don't recognize, because they're so consumed with that and don't have the bandwidth to absorb much else, there is better in other ways down the road. So it's the fact that the child has died and is no longer going to be there, that is never going to feel any different, I don't think, to parents. And I think that we do learn somehow to put that in a place where we can put one foot in front of the other and find other things that we can make better despite that. But that piece there is just in your heart, and that's where it's going to stay.
Right. So, yeah, and I like that you brought that up, because when we talk about does it ever get better, what is it? And that the fact that our child is not here with us on this earth anymore, that part doesn't get better. But life itself can get better. And we can learn how to live a life with meaning and purpose again. It's going to look different. And I know one thing that I try to make a point to tell parents is when we're talking about this kind of a subject, and if we ever use the word healing, or feeling healed, or get to a point where you're healed, we're not talking about being to a place where it's all behind you. That's impossible. But when we talk about like having hope and getting to a place of healing, those kinds of things, we're talking about getting to a point again where you're beyond just surviving, and you're learning how to live life again with meaning and purpose. You're learning how to live a life that is fulfilling again, but it looks different. So when we're talking about healing, that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about it's behind you, there's closure. I was talking to Dennis Apple the other day, and he was talking about the word closure, and he said he likes to use the word reconcile, like a bank statement. You learn to reconcile this, and there's never closure. There's never closure, is there?
Those words and all those phrases and descriptions, I think, lend parents to think even in a worse sense that, oh my gosh, I know I'm never going to get to that point. But I think that's a common thing, though, with people in the beginning. They just don't know. They don't know what the path is from here to there. I've often said to families, I'd love to give you a remote control and have you like remote control to some point in your life where maybe you are feeling a little bit better and you recognize that and you're comfortable with that. But I can't. And I also can't tell you how you're going to get from here to there. All I can tell you is that you're gonna. And for you, your journey is going to be different. The tools that you're going to be using to get there may be different than the next parent. But that this is part of this whole period of grief. And this is the work of grief, is discovering and figuring out what is going to work for me to get me to get back into a life that I can find some peace and joy in, and still carry, because you're going to carry it with you anyhow. That's never going to leave. So now how do I do that? How do I hold on to my loved one when the rest of the world is indicating me that I need to let go? And as a parent, you don't ever want to let go of your child. So you need to find ways to stay connected to that child. And I think that's ultimately, as a bereaved parent, that's what we do, is we find ways to stay connected to them when the rest of the world is telling you got to let go of that, you got to put it behind you. That is not possible. So some of us find those ways, like yourself. You're doing all this work that you're doing, and it's wonderful, and you're reaching out to other bereaved parents. There's other people that don't do that at such a grand scale. It might be a smaller scale, but each are equally important to find those ways to stay connected. And that's how we get through. And again, I can't define it for any individual of what that entails or what that encompasses, but that is how we get through. How do I maintain that connection with my loved one, no longer being here in front of me, but that all the ways they were part of my life, I didn't just lose my loved one there before me. I lost all the ways that they were part of my life. And that includes the past, the future, and the present. And so, okay, so now where do we go from there? What tools can I find? What can help me that can get me to make those steps into the direction that I do find peace and joy. And I do truly learn how to live with grief and joy being in the same heart. And that is possible.
Yeah. And that was something that that I learned too, which surprised me, is that we can get to a point where peace and pain live inside of us at the same time. And it was a little perplexing to me for a while how that can even happen. And then God just opened my eyes to show me that peace is a fruit of the spirit. So peace is something that happens in our spirit. Pain is something that happens in our soul, in our emotions, in our mind, our thoughts, our hearts. And so that's how peace and pain really can be in us at the same time, because the pain is in our soul, but peace is in our spirit. And because I used to think it was one or the other. If I didn't have peace, I mean, if I was in pain, I wasn't leaning on God enough. I wasn't doing enough to get out of this pain, and that it was my job and my responsibility to figure this out. And but to realize that I don't have to get to a certain point to also have peace, that it's a gift that I can learn how to receive. I can open myself up to receive the peace while I'm in pain. And that really, we kind of live that way from this point on, don't we?
We truly do. And it's almost like you want to give that gift of knowledge to every bereaved parent that you come across, but you really can't. They have to learn it, they have to live it, they have to grow with it. And it has to be what again, all the work of what grief truly is. I mean, I wish we could just give that to them and give them their remote control, but again, it's a necessary part of what we need to go through in order to get to that place. And again, find that for each individual is just going to be very different. So.
And I know within that, each journey is very different. And yet we also know there are some pieces of it that seem to be very similar, stops along the way, things that we have to work through or whatever. I'm just curious, and sometimes it helps other parents to hear what was it like for you. So could you maybe, Lynda, share just a little bit of your journey, that just kind of what was going on emotionally with you, maybe that first year, second year, 5 years? What did that journey look like for you, especially at the beginning?
Oh, at the beginning, it just was just, like I said, it was just horrible. I was completely distraught. I was completely at a place where I just couldn't believe that this has happened. How did this happen to me? I always thought, never, babies don't die. That just doesn't happen, and it was just horrible. Those first, I don't know, first few years actually were really difficult. Even though I got into the work of supporting other people, I felt that maybe in that first year, I really didn't have support from family and friends. I mean, in my type of loss, my own father told me, I think 3 days after Aubrey died, I don't want to get into your business, but I would suggest that you and Bob have another child. And it was like, I hadn't even left the hospital. We hadn't even had, the burial for our daughter. And, I love him to shreds. But again, that was the type of thing that was really difficult for me, is that first off, I felt like my loss was just ignored. In our story, in our circumstance, Aubrey was born on Labor Day weekend that year, and it was a Friday that we went in. Well, we went in Thursday night and had her Friday. And so there was like limited amount of staff in the hospital that weekend. And so Aubrey was born on Friday. And then by Tuesday, we were ready to send me home. And the vital statistics lady had come in because we didn't fill out the birth certificate. Now, first off, I didn't know that I needed to fill out a birth certificate and, complete that and sign it, because again, I was in this state of just shock.
Well, who would? Yeah, wow.
But in the midst of all of it, Laura, nobody told us we had a little girl. So when Aubrey was born, I know people have that same reaction. No, everything was just so chaotic and so crazy. Again, my memory of that, I was in shock. There were certain pieces of that I don't even remember. My hearing went. I know the doctor was trying to tell me something, but I didn't hear anything. But anyhow, in all of that, nobody came to us and said that Aubrey was a girl. And my husband had seen her. They had taken pictures, and he held her when she died, when they took the respirator from her and all that. And it was just a horrible thing. So now the vital statistics lady comes in and she's like, well, why haven't you filled out this birth certificate? Now, first thing I'm thinking, I don't know why I'd have to, right? And then the second thing was, she goes, well, did you have a boy or a girl? And I just looked at her and I said, nobody told us. And she was like, what? That same reaction. She's like, oh my gosh. So she went down to the morgue because our daughter was still there. The funeral man come to pick her up yet. And she came back and she said, you had a little girl. And that was the first I knew, was Tuesday. I had her on a Friday, and that was Tuesday. And then we just looked at that at the time. We were like, oh my gosh, it's just, how did we not know that? And again, you still don't digest it. You still don't understand it. and it just doesn't make any sense. And then as we, churned through the following weeks, obviously we went back and talked to the caregivers, talked to the doctors to try and figure out what, that was one of my biggest things. I needed to find out what happened. What happened to her?
Yeah.
Did
What
this
went wrong? That was just so wrong.
just, what did I do? And as a parent, what did I do that did or caused this? What did I
Mm.
not do or do that caused this? And it was
Yeah, I was
just,
going to ask you about the guilt and all of that kind of stuff.
it was horrible. I
Mm.
just couldn't figure out what it was that I did. And I know during that pregnancy, I did smoke cigarettes. That was horrible. But when I went back to the doctor, it was a pediatric doctor that had been at the delivery. And I sat there at her desk, like just sobbing and saying, I just, I smoked and I don't know what I did. And she opened up her drawer and she took out a pack of cigarettes and she put it in front of me and she said, "You smoke a cigarette right now." She goes, "There is nothing that you did or didn't do that caused your daughter to die." But I still was on that mission of trying to find out. I mean, those
Mhm.
months, I really needed to know what happened to her. And you know what I found out, Laura, through all of that? I found out exactly what happened to her. They explained how she had developed as a fetus into a baby and all this other stuff and how this happened and this didn't form right. I mean, we had this extensive, extensive autopsy report. And I went back several times and I had even PhD students sitting with me explaining the definition. This is how much detail I needed.
Mhm.
Exactly what all these words meant. Even after all was said and done, I looked at that and I still said, why? So I
Mhm.
needed to get to that point myself, and it took like months to do that, to churn through all that what ifs and what did I do wrong? How did this happen? Why did this happen? So I think that was the most difficult, to answer the question. That's the most difficult part I had, was trying to figure out how did this happen with no support, with nobody in my closest family and friends that even had anything to do with it. Um, I mean, it was really, that was the most difficult thing for me. And then also one of the difficult parts was is my husband went back to work and I was home. So I was sitting home with a nursery with no baby in it. And
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
happened to be that when backing up to when my mother died, my husband and I had bought this heart-shaped floral arrangement that we had at the funeral home. Now you're talking a year and a half later, I still had it hanging up on my wall in my living
Mhm.
room and it was just dead and it just stunk to whatever. And I remember sitting there looking at that thing thinking, actually praying to God and saying, "Dear God, just let me close my eyes and let me just not be here." And
Mhm.
that's how bad
Yeah.
it got. I just
Yeah.
wanted to close my eyes and not be here. And that was the end of it. I just wanted it to be over with. And
Yeah,
so
I did the same thing. I just begged God, just take me, just take me,
just be
just
easy
take
up.
me. And I had four other children, and my husband and two grandchildren. Becca's daughter. I mean, the daughter of the daughter I lost. But there's just something in us that it's like we don't know how we can live the rest of our lives with this kind of pain, because we can't see it ever ending.
No.
We feel like I'm going to be stuck here the rest of my life and I can't do this. I literally cannot live with this kind of pain anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that was, again, answering the question, that was my most difficulty, trying to figure out why this happened, being completely isolated, feeling like I didn't have support. And then just feeling like what is the reason for all of this? Like, why do I have to feel this way? And I just couldn't take it. And again, then from there, I started, I put myself in counseling, went through different things, tried different things to help myself feel better. And, just went in that a better direction because I wasn't going any direction when I was sitting there looking at that dead wreath up. I
Hmm.
was just like in no direction, just sobbing and just like not knowing what, just wanted it over with. And,
Hmm.
never planned to do anything, never, that kind of thing. But
Right.
yeah, it was really difficult. I just had to find those ways, in which I think is what motivated me to do the work that I ended up doing, is because I really needed to put something together and provide resources and information and support to other families so that they wouldn't feel that desperation. And what I learned anyhow is that they're going to feel the desperation anyhow, but that if they also have this information, it's more than nothing. Which
Hmm.
I felt like I had nothing, and so that kind of was my mission in life. Actually, I started out providing what I call a resource and referral service. I put all these resources together in different, books and writings, and we didn't have the internet back then, so we didn't have that.
Hmm.
But that became my mission in life. And then when I went down the road of working with funeral homes, I've often said that my life work is my daughter's legacy. I mean, her
Hmm.
life,
Yes.
2 hours and 9 minutes she lived, but she's lived in my heart all these years. And that this is her legacy, what I'm doing. And this is my way of turning around what was really bad for me that I can never change. And, we talk about changing pain, or changing pain into purpose. That's what I've done. And I think any of us are capable of doing that, but maybe in different
Hmm.
ways.
Yeah, yeah. That whole why thing is always I don't know of any parent that doesn't go through the why. The why. Why me? Why my child? Why couldn't I stop it? Why didn't God stop it? Why? I mean, we're just so consumed with the whys because we want answers. And it's fascinating to me that you went I mean, that was like an obsession to you to figure out the why, and yet it didn't bring you any more peace or any more. It didn't do anything. It didn't do what you wanted it to do because it didn't change the fact that your child was still gone. It
Exactly.
doesn't change that fact. And so I think when we kind of go to God, and it's okay to demand, God, I want to know why. But I think what I really encourage parents with is to get to the point where you can turn the corner, because the why questions, even if he did tell us why, like you, even if he did tell us why, it's not a good enough answer. It's just not good enough. And I think about a teenager who, like, maybe they want the keys to the car, and you're telling them no, and they want to know why. And they don't want to know why because, oh, okay, I get it. Thanks. I'll go on my merry way. They want to know why because they want to argue with you why your reason isn't good enough.
Right.
That's why they want to know why, because they want to argue against your why, because you can't have a reason good enough to not give me the keys tonight. And I think that's the way we are with God. I mean, he is so much bigger. So, I mean, we try to bring him down to a place where we can understand God. And if we can do that, he's not God anymore. He's not big enough to be God. If I can put him in my little box and get him to do what I need him to do and give all me these whys that make sense, how can it possibly make sense, this finite God giving me? I mean, it's like me trying to get Dave to explain all this technical stuff to me. I just glaze over. I mean, I can ask him why, and he just like, really, because you're not going to understand it, well, just tell me. And he starts, and then we're both frustrated because he's right. I don't understand these it's like, can you do this for me on the computer? Well, no, hon, I can't. Why? And so I think the key, when we find ourselves really trapped in those whys, I try to encourage parents to change the question. Instead of why, change the question to something like how. How can I get through this? How can I come out of this darkness? How can I, like, turn my child's life into a legacy so that people will remember him or her as long as I'm here anyway? How am I going to, this scripture of God promising to work everything out for good? I mean, when you're in that darkness, that's a scripture that'll, it's almost like, it's one of those, almost like a political thing. You either hate that scripture or you hold on to it as an anchor. It's like one or the other. Because I hear some people, some parents will say, that's the scripture I hung on to, that God promised he was going to work this out somehow in a good way in my life. And other parents are just like, get that out of my Bible. That is just such crap, such a load of crap. How can God possibly take the death of my child and turn it into something good in my life? That's impossible. And so when we say, well, how, God, how are you going to do that? How? Instead of asking why. And then those are the questions God's like, I'm glad you asked. I'll show you how.
It's
And
almost like
so,
changing the
yeah.
conversation that you're having with God
Mm-hmm.
from one of, why as to one of how can I, like you just described, it seems to me that's what we need to do, is change that conversation we're having with them.
Yeah. And it's okay to have the other
Yeah.
conversations. I mean, we need to. We need to.
But that's
Um,
what's important. I tell people that when they're going through all those, would have, should have, could have's, or feelings of guilt or what have you, most of the world will tell people, you don't put yourself through that. You don't think like that. And I tell
mhm.
people, you know what? If you have to think like that, go ahead and think like that for as long
Yes.
as you need to, because at some point
Yes.
you in your own right will no longer need to do that. Now, I
Mm-hmm.
tell them, in addition to that, if I'm talking to you 2 years from now and you're still saying, not that there's time limit to anything, but if you're still having the same conversation with me, then it's time to talk about something different. But when you lose your child, again, there's no time frame as to how long you're going to get through this process or how you're going to experience it. But those thoughts, you cannot suppress them. You have
Mm-hmm.
to express them. You have to talk about them, write about them, admit them, think about them in
Yeah.
your head, because you
Yeah.
can't stop that process. That, again, that's part of what the grief work is going through that whole scenario in your head. You know, what if, and if I've done this, and you know, try and explore what happened and why it happened. You need to do that as an individual, and there's nothing that's going to stop that. And I think it causes more frustration and more anguish if you constantly are trying to push that down and not experience it and not allow yourself to experience it and think it. So I tell people, you think what you need to think and find that person you can talk to about it, because that's the best you can do for yourself.
Yeah, and as you were talking, it came back to that thought of what Dennis said about reconciling. You have to go through that process to reconcile. And if you don't, then that unbalanced checkbook is just going to become more and more of a mess, and it's going to be harder to reconcile it down the road for a lot of people than if you just do the grief work. You work through the grief, you let yourself ask those questions, you let your mind think what it needs to think, as long as you're not thinking harm. But you know, ask those questions and think through those thoughts, because that's how you reconcile what has happened, to be able to come out the other side so that life can get better. It can get better, and it will get better when you allow yourself. You have to allow it though, don't you?
You do. You do. You know, I've often said to people, you know, picture, like, you know how you use a sifter to sift sugar, and
Mm-hmm.
the sugar through, and the sugar's coming out at the other end, and bits and pieces are coming out. Well, when you're grieving, it's almost like you're sifting through all of whatever your experience is. And sometimes you come to a chunk of sugar that you kind of got to break up a little bit more to get it through. You know, that's kind of what we're doing. We're sifting through our entire experience. And that takes time and energy, and that takes a lot of work.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
it's not, none of it is easy, as you know, and as any bereaved parent would know. There's nothing easy about this. And again, it's all necessary in order to get to that place that we eventually need to be, of what's good for us as an individual.
Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes we don't recognize that it is getting better because it happens in such slow increments that we think nothing is happening. An example is Dave and I were at a conference this past summer. I think it was. Anyway, we were in Ohio, and someone came up to Dave and a mom and said it had been something like 10 years and it's never gotten any better. And the thought was, is, you know, Dave told me this, and he's like, she doesn't realize she has gotten better, or she wouldn't have been here. She'd have still been curled up in a ball at home somewhere. So it
Yeah,
has gotten better, but it
yeah,
just happens so slowly that I think sometimes we don't realize it because it's such hard work, and because we're in that darkness for so long that we don't recognize. And then it's like it feels like an all of a sudden there's a day where all of a sudden I notice the sun, or all of a sudden there's a day where I did I cry today? I don't think I cried today. It feels like an all of a sudden thing, but it really isn't. It's just such tiny increments. And along that line, I'm curious to know, Lynda, for a lot of parents, because we're talking about this, does it ever get better? But for a lot of parents, and like you said, there's no it's hard to say, because you can't gauge yourself based on other people's grief, and yet we do know there are maybe some mile markers, or some guidelines, that if you know a lot of other parents have experienced this, then it's okay if I experience this because others have too. And for a lot of parents, that second year is harder than the first year.
that's, yeah. Well, I think too, that first year you're in what, that grief fog in the deepest sense, you know.
Hmm.
And then also there's the factor that maybe you do have a little bit more support during that first year.
Hmm.
And then, you know, people, I think, anticipate that the first year is going to be the worst, and then they wake up the day after the first year anniversary and they still feel the same and nothing has changed, and then they just continue on. So sometimes it is, you know, it is felt that that is worse. And, you know, bereaved parents say 5 years out they're still feeling like they're in that grief fog. I mean, again, there's no, you know, set limits. I think we look at what our function is in our lives, which that can help us to gauge where we're at. How are you functioning in your life, you know, with this grief being a part of it? I think that's you're talking about some indicators of, you know, how do I know I've taken these little steps? I mean, just look at what you're doing in your life. Are you still rolled up in a ball in your bed 18 months later, or are you sitting at the kitchen table having dinner with your family and, you know, watching the news or something? I mean, you got to look
Yeah.
at your life and what are you actually doing? It's not so much as what you're feeling, because what you're feeling is
Yeah.
there. It's so
Yes.
much as what are you actually doing? And people don't recognize that as progress. You know,
Hmm.
They don't look at that piece of it.
Yeah, I was talking to Mitch Carmody, and he said he remembers the day. It's like, I made it to the coffee pot today. It's like victory. It's like, it's crazy how such a little thing can make us feel like maybe I am getting somewhere. I made it to the
I'm glad
coffee
that
pot.
I did that.
It's a good day. And that's really kind of how we have to look at it, and not beat ourselves up because we're not further than we think we should be or than we want to be. We've got to give ourselves a lot of grace. I mean, we've talked about that on almost every 20 some discussions we've had, is how important it is not to beat yourself up, not to expect things from yourself that you're just not capable of being there yet, to give yourself a lot of grace in this.
And you have to. I mean, and again, I think in the midst of it, it's hard to even recognize that or define it or try to do that. But again, that's all part of setting up your support and doing things that somehow can help you to feel a little better, because then you learn those things from other people. I mean, we can't isolate ourselves when we're grieving. As much as we do want to roll up in that little ball and lay in bed and do nothing, really the worst thing to do is to isolate ourselves. Even if just for a little bit we can get out and do something, even if it's just, I tell people, go put a chair in the lawn and put your bare feet into the grass and just sit there. I can't
Hmm.
tell how many times people come back and say to me, geez, that was really nice. I've never done that before. Just little things that you just wouldn't think of. But if you didn't reach out for support, if you didn't try and access different ways to help, you'd never learn that. Even though it's so simple, there'd be nobody there to tell you that if you didn't
Right.
for yourself try and access that. I mean, that's the best thing we can do for ourselves, is to get that support that we need and find those tools that we can use that are going to help us. And not all tools are going to help all of us,
Right. Right.
that I would never look at and consider, and that's same for other people. But there is
Mhm.
so much out there now, especially with the internet, so many resources. And I know it can be daunting, which is another good reason to get involved in a group, because other people are sharing the things that they have found to be helpful. So it spares
Yeah.
you a little bit of legwork and trying to find some things.
And feeling overwhelmed at
Right.
how much is out there now.
Yeah,
Hmm.
that
Find
is
a group you can connect with, and just plug in. And if all you do is watch and read for a while, that's fine.
yep,
That's fine. Yeah. So I do think it's important for parents to know not to bring fear, but so that if it does happen to them, I mean, we feel like it's impossible to get worse. But I think, like you said, sometimes it's because that fog lifts. And for me, like you mentioned, the second year was harder for me. And I think part of it was because I had braced myself through all the firsts. And so I thought, okay, I've been through this once, this year will be better. And because I thought that, and because there wasn't as much fog there, it was just really hard, because it was more of a realization of the reality. And so it doesn't mean it's going to happen to everybody, and it doesn't mean it's going to be that second year. I was talking to someone Monday night that said, I think it was like their fifth year was their worst year, and that was because they spent the first year immersing themselves in anything and everything that would keep them from realizing what had happened. And
mhm,
so they just postponed everything. And so it's just as a reassurance that if it does get worse before it gets better, that's normal too. That's normal too. And you can still come out the other side, and it will still get better, even though it may get worse for a while. If you do the grief work, and if you connect, and if you find things that, and I love what you said, the tools, what's helpful for one person is not going to be helpful for another. And so if you find something's like, oh my goodness, I can't believe they said that, or they do that, or it's like, well, then just get rid of it and find what works for you. Because we're all on such an individual journey. One thing that I think has really helped me in some of those dark times was a change in perspective, a change in how I saw something or how I thought about something. And for me, one example would be, which I've heard this now since then, but it was a new thought to me that God just dropped into me because I needed it, and I didn't have anyone sharing it with me. But I would get almost like these panic attacks, hard to breathe, when I would think about Becca and being being here like 2 years, a year without her, 5 years, 10 years. I mean, it was almost like I couldn't breathe. I couldn't even imagine being on this earth for 10 years or more without Becca. I mean, it just, like, I almost couldn't breathe. And it was like, God, you've got to do something, because this thought just keeps tormenting me. And what he spoke to my heart was that, Laura, you're not getting further away from her. Every day and every year, you're getting closer to her. You're getting closer and closer to being with her again. And that just totally, for me, totally diffused that thought of, and I can go there. I mean, I can choose to go there. I can choose to go there and sit and think about, it has been 8.5 years, and let myself spiral down. I can choose to do that. But, or I can choose to think, yeah, but I'm that much closer now. I am that much closer to being with her forever, never to be separated again. And so there have been several moments that I have had a specific time where something, whether it was a person speaking it to me, something I read, or God speaking something directly to my heart, where there was a change in perspective that just, it was just that exactly what I needed to help me get further away from the darkness and closer to that light and getting better that I needed. Can you think of any time specifically that you had a change in perspective of something?
Yes, I can. And actually, it was like within the last couple of years, which again, for me, it's over 30 years since we lost Aubrey, but I'd been doing some work with another lay counselor at my church, and we had been talking about some things, about grief and all of that. And she asked me the question, she said, what is your difficulty at this point with having lost Aubrey? And I said, well, the most difficulty that I have is that, when her birthday's coming up, I always think, oh my gosh, she should be here for her birthday, and the things that she was going to be missing out on. And, that seems to be the lingering thing that happens. And some years are worse than others, I'll admit that. And so anyhow, she had told me about this other counselor that she had been talking with that lost a child, a baby. And she says, maybe one of these times that you come in and we visit, we'll get him on the phone and we'll talk to him about that, and it's okay. So this particular day I had another time slot that I was going to go visit with her, and I was driving along and I was actually thinking in my mind the whole thing about what we were talking about, like what is really causing me the most pain and sorrow and grief and tears and what have you. It was all of that, all of the things that we missed. And so I go to this appointment with her and I'm sitting there and I'm talking to her and she says, oh, so-and-so's on the phone. We're going to have our conversation today. And it was like, well, you talk about a God thing, right? I'm like, really? I was just thinking about all this, does this have to do with Aubrey we were talking about? So anyhow, I got on the phone with him. We were doing a three-way conversation. And he said to me, he says, he didn't say, change your perspective or your thought process. He says, I like to think, he said, when my daughter died, he goes, I did that for a few years. She wasn't here. We didn't have her here to celebrate her birthday. He says, but now I think of it as, she spent all those years in heaven with Jesus celebrating her birthday, something that probably all of us would like to do one day. And you talk about that aha moment. I was like, oh, I never looked at it like that. I mean, as much as, I love my God, I practice my religion. I didn't apply that to her. I was just like, I knew someday I would see her again. And I just, again, lived towards that day. But when he said that, I was like, yeah, you're right. I'm like, here I'm complaining and being sorrowful because she's in heaven on her birthday. Well, she's in the best place anybody could ever be for their birthday.
Boy, what a party they can give her up there.
I just would have told me that, but it really hit my heart that, yeah, he's right. So all these years that I felt, sad and all of that and cried and just wish that she were here. I can't wish that for her anymore. It was like this light bulb went off that, yeah, although I knew that's where she was. Yeah. Specifically on her birthday. She's there too on her birthday. So,
right.
How,
it's interesting how that's a change in perspective of thinking about the difference of what we have lost out and thinking about what they are losing out on here and not thinking about what they have gained there. I had a similar conversation within the last year or two with someone who had, her son died, he was 5, and it's been over 30 years for her. And we were talking about this kind of stuff. And I all of a sudden, as we were having this conversation, I thought, we feel like we're missing out on all these stories and things that that we don't get to have with our child. And the thought hit me, when I get to heaven, you know what's going to be incredible? Having someone like Moses come up to me and say, I got to tell you what Becca did the other day. It was so funny. I mean, to hear the stories in heaven, when we get to heaven, we get to hear those stories that we're missing now. And those stories are going to be crazy good. You know, having someone like the Apostle Paul come up saying, I just love your daughter. I have loved having her here. You know, I mean, just those kinds of things, boy, those can really flip a switch in us.
Well, they can. And again, I think that, that's a good thing. I mean, all these years, I never thought of it like that, even though I thought knew I was going to see her one day and all those other things, but I never applied it to what was the most difficult parts that were lingering for me. So she's not, another birthday, she's not here. So now I think the last couple of years on her birthday, oh no, she's in heaven. She's, I always knew that, but now I have a different thought process about it, that she's the one, she's where, and again, here's where it comes down to. We have to have a tremendous amount of patience to get to that point when we're going to see them again. I mean, that I think we have to learn that as we go along, is that patience, that, our knowledge is there, we're going to see our children again, but we need that patience to muster up the energy to get through our lives to get to that point. And we will. And it's important what we do during that time to help ourselves is what's important.
Yeah, I think of Barbara Bush. They lost their daughter, Robin, when she was like 4 years old or so. And I mean, I looked it up, and we've actually been to the grave this last year of President Bush and Barbara, and their daughter was moved to the presidential library, and it was like 65 years that Barbara had to wait to join her daughter. But I truly believe that once we get there, what happened down here is going to be like that. I mean, it's going to feel like once we're there, it's going to seem like what was here was nothing. What we went through was nothing. I mean, the verse in Romans 8 that talks about that the glory that he has for us can't even be compared to the suffering. And I think about how deep and dark our suffering is. And to think that the glory can't even be compared to that, it's like, wow. And that's where our kids are. They're experiencing that. And so we can either continue to drown ourselves in our loss, or we can choose. And sometimes it really doesn't feel like a choice. We're so consumed by the grief that we have to go through, that we have to work through. But to even have that thought tucked in the back of our head, God, bring that to me someday when I'm ready to receive that thought, bring it back to me, that that I am getting closer, and that thinking about her there and picturing her there and what she's doing, and all those things that, like you said, the little pieces that still linger, that still cause the grief triggers and the meltdowns, that it's the whole thing is just a process. It's such a process and a journey for sure.
Yeah, that it is.
Yeah. So we've kind of alluded to it, but there is still going back and forth, isn't it? I mean, even though we can feel like I'm in a good place now, I'm functioning, my life has meaning and purpose again, but there are times that we can be thrown back into that, can't we?
Oh, certainly there are. I mean, there still is times. I mean, there's milestones. There's, other people for myself and the family that, my niece, if she ever gets married, I have a daughter who's not, you know what I mean? Again, and I'm trying to use my new perspective on that, but it is there. And you can, as you know, at any time, bring yourself back to the time that you really were feeling your worst. I mean, I don't have a lot from Aubrey because obviously she was a baby. So I didn't have, a lot of pictures and mementos.
Right.
Going forward,
Which
but
that in itself is its own grief.
exactly. And I've always had this box with just the few things that I have, and I'd say, I'm going to visit with Aubrey now because I feel like I need to visit with her. So I'd take my box out and I would go through it, and I tell you, I can get right back to where I was the day I put that box together, and I think that after so much time, you then do have the skills and the knowledge to know that it's not going to last, that deep sorrow and darkness, it just might be just for a minute. It's not, I know that it's not going to still linger and be there continuously. Where in the beginning, you don't even see where that's going to end. Right. And so, those things are going to happen down the road, and we're better able to handle them, but it's never going to just go away completely. And so again, I go back to, how am I going to honor my daughter so that when I have those times and I'm feeling like that, what can I do that's going to help me to honor her and feel connected to her? And so for me, I have my little things that I do that help me to feel connected to her. I do that. I go on to the next thing.
Mhm.
never forgetting her, never ever forgetting her, never loving her any
Right.
less.
And that,
And
yeah. And that's what I wanted to really emphasize. I don't want anyone to think that we're saying it's going to get better and you'll get to the point where it just doesn't bother you anymore. And I mean, and it shouldn't be that way. I mean, if we get to the point where we don't miss our child, something's wrong. We've either become hard-hearted. I mean, something is wrong if we get to the point where we, I just don't miss her anymore. It just doesn't bother me anymore. I can go on with life. And I mean, I, I don't know. To
going
me,
on there,
that would be,
yeah.
yeah, there's something not right there. So
And I
I mean, it's
think
your child's always
we have
going to.
in that, right? As we go along, we have more confidence in ourselves. We're never, I mean, we knew we weren't going to forget him, but there's that solid confidence that, no, I'm never going to forget my child. I'm never going to love her any less. She's never going to be any less important. It's all, that is all the same. That has all remained the same. What has
Mhm.
changed is my life and how I lead it. And my day to day, what I do day to day is what has changed. Walking
And how,
along with her being right where she's always been. And
yeah, how we
that's,
carry our grief and how we carry our child is what changes. So, and it's actually been an hour, believe it or not. Yeah. So I want to just run through. I wanted to talk a little bit about, well, the couple things that I want to make sure we get in here, I guess, is the statement that time heals. Time heals all wounds, and that's just not true. I don't agree with that anyway. To me, it's what you do with your time.
yep, that's exactly
It's
what I would say.
yeah,
It's not so much the time that goes by, it's what you're doing with that time. And again, that's reaching into, what can I do for myself during this time, and
mhm,
making that effort to find those things that are going to help you, even if it's as simple as turning, watching a movie that's funny, comedy, simple as
mhm,
little things that we can do. But again, we have to put the effort and thought into that, so that as that time goes by, we're doing something with that. It
mhm.
doesn't matter that it's been a year or 2 years or 5 years. What are we doing with that time is what's
Yes,
important.
exactly. Are we working through the grief? Are we working, yeah, working it out? And I think we've already mentioned some of those things, connecting with other parents, helping others. That's something that you and I have both done, and it doesn't have to be something big. I mean, it can be just doing some sort of a walkathon, joining a walkathon for the cause of death that your child had, or I mean, they're just it's endless. I mean, you can do searches, it's endless on ways that you can reach out to help people, serving at a soup kitchen. I mean, it's just starting a scholarship at your child's school. It's just endless. But reaching out and helping others is something that brings a healing to us. And then another thing that we haven't talked about that is helpful for a lot of people is to start a thankfulness journal,
Yeah.
because I think it's, if we can force ourselves, like every night before we go to bed, just get a little notebook and force yourself to write down maybe two or three things that you can find. You can think about, I smelled cookies today, baking, and they
Yeah.
smelled really good. Thank you. I could smell these good smelling cookies. Thank you that I could, the rain matched my my grief today. It rained, and it just was a comfort almost in a way. Just even if it's just the littlest thing. I saw a child laugh and it actually put a smile on my face. I mean,
Yeah.
no matter how small it is, I think when you begin to work your way towards things that you can still be thankful for, even if it seems small or foolish, those things will grow and then increase. Start writing down five things or whatever. But I think finding ways, there are things going on around you that you can be thankful for. And
That's right.
even to go into the day, Lord, help me to find something today that I can be thankful for, that I can write in my journal tonight, because I can't see anything to be thankful for right now. And ask Him to help you, to show you.
You know what else I've told people too? Again, I've said, because my faith is very important to me, is I said, just put a smile on your face and thank God for encircling you with his love. And
Yes.
amazing how literally you smile about that, and it just really, really does help people to stop in that instant and be like, okay. And it sounds like very minute and not much of anything, but just put a
Hmm.
smile on your face, and God is encircling you with his love. You don't need to say anything or do anything else, and then go on to the next moment. And that's again part of taking that moment to see that, and can help do
Yeah.
that.
And even the thought. smile, because God loves you so much that he made a way for us not to be separated forever. This isn't permanent. This isn't a
Yeah.
permanent separation. So yeah. Is there, so I'm just going to ask this one last question, and then if you have anything else to share, and we'll let people know how to connect with you. But if someone were sitting in front of you right now and the tears are just running, and they were to ask you, does this ever get better? I feel like the first thing you'd probably do is grab them and hug them, hold them, maybe. We can't do that today.
I might do this.
But
You know what?
what would you tell someone?
You know what I say, Laura? Because you obviously that's been asked a million times. I say, I choose to believe that for you, it will get better.
Hmm.
That's all I can say is that I choose to believe that. And I hope that someday that you feel that same belief and you will discover how you're going to get there. And that's all I can say is that because I do believe it. And
Hmm.
telling somebody who's in the midst of that deep sorrow, obviously they're not believing anything. So that's the only answer I've ever found to have that is I choose to believe that you will feel better.
Hmm. And like Gloria Horsley says, just grab onto my hope until you have your own.
Yep,
So,
exactly.
yeah. Yeah. So, can you quickly tell us, Lynda, you're part of the International Grief Institute, and is that part of what you're doing with the aftercare
Well,
stuff?
right. Yes, I partner with Lynda Fell at the International Grief
Hmm.
Institute. We're doing a lot of work with training and education and grief support and those types of things, trying to reach into communities to train people to work with grieving families. But I say my day job is I do work for funeral homes as an aftercare coordinator. So that's my role. That's what I do during the day is follow up with families for at least a year after their loss. And so I have all kinds of information about, resources and those kinds of things. Anybody's welcome to contact me. I think you have my email. It's the
Hmm.
Lynda dot, what is it? Lynda Findlay at International, Lynda at
Yeah.
internationalinstitute.com. That's what it is. I got
Yeah.
too many. Like, wait a minute, it's Lynda. Anyhow, you have you can use the Lynda at internationalgriefinstitute.com to get a hold of me. We have a lot of resources on our website that are free that people can just go and print some information off if they want it. So that'd be the best way to get a hold of me.
Okay, so down in the description, we'll have that email address and the website, so people can take a look at that and connect with you if they want to. So, well, and people can check out GPS Hope too. So we have a lot of support and resources also. So gpshope.org. So check us out there also. And Lynda, thank you so much. This hour, it really did fly by.
Talking to you. Thank you so much, and God bless you for all the work that you're doing. Truly, you're
Oh,
helping a lot of people. So God
oh,
bless you.
thank you. Thank you. So just remember, guys, it will get better. And yeah, Lynda and I both believe that for you if you can't believe it for yourself.
Yep, that's right.